We're back, and we are almost in our last panel. And I'd like to thank all of the previous panelists and now turn to the focus on Israel. Let me start by saying that Mr. Ohad Cohen from the Prime Minister Office and Mrs. Shira Greenberg from the Finance Ministry couldn't join us today. So instead, we brought great panelists. We have Mr. Ron Eifer, Economic Advisor at the Prime Minister Office. And we have Mr. Eyal Medan, Director of Multilateral Development Banks Division in the Ministry of Finance. And with me at the table, I have Asaf Barnea, CEO of Sanera Ventures, and Mr. Ariel Delumi, Chairman, SEED Israel, and Co-Executive Director of Ajik Nisped. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. And I will actually start with the Prime Minister Office, Mr. Ron Eifer. Would you kindly tell us a bit about the efforts that are being taken here in Israel during the pandemic, and how do we see the international cooperation and development from your point of view?
Okay, so thank you. We at the Prime Minister Office are coordinating a governmental committee that is aiming to increase the involvement of Israel and the government of Israel in the sphere of international development. So we just launched an intermediate report that lays out all the strategy that the government of Israel have come with. And I urge all the people who are listening to us right now to read the report, or at least the executive summary of the report, and give us comments. We are very eager to receive your comments about the strategy that we just shaped. Coming back to your question about the pandemic, the strategy, we worked on the strategy for almost 2 years now. So we started working on the strategy before the pandemic. But I think the strategy is very relevant for the pandemic and for the consequences it has on the international development and the developing world. And I want to focus maybe on 2 issues. The first issue is that we, as the government of Israel, decided what are the topics that we are going to prioritize when we work in international development. That this is the prioritization of the government of Israel as a whole. And 2 topics that are part of the prioritization is first health, mainly in the sphere of digital health, that the connection to the pandemic is clear. And second is emergency response. We believe that we have a lot of experience in emergency response, both practical experience and also in technological aspects. And we would like to share this knowledge with the developing world and collaborate with it regarding those issues. The second issue is financing. Israel is probably, is not let's put it gently, it's not the country in the highest rank among the OECD countries in terms of donating ODA, overseas development assistance, to developing countries. We're actually at the top bottom of the OECD countries. And unfortunately, because of the pandemic and the budgetary constraints that the pandemic will bring with it, I don't see how the government of Israel is going to change it dramatically. However, I do think that there is a big opportunity here to increase our involvement in blended finance and financing the private sector to go and work at the developing countries. And I think the pandemic gave us a great reasoning for that as well. Because if the UN measured the SDG gaps between $3.3 to $4.5 trillion a year, I think the SDGs gap now after the pandemic will increase, but the participation of ODA there will be smaller. So those 2 vectors make a bigger gap for involvement in terms of blended finance and private sector.
But would you agree that Israel is, as you said, very good on emergency response, And here comes a global crisis which requires something different than immediate and fast and maybe harsh response. It requires more resources on planning and strategy and maybe even long-term advisory. And Israel, maybe on that front, it's not at its best, I suppose, with this, but the pandemic actually needed us to be more focused on long-term planning, and it's not as good as it could be.
I don't agree with you completely. I will give you an example. Developing countries are seeking from Israel not only technologies, but also regulatory know-how and understand how to manage systems in the long term. I agree with you that there are things that we are less good at, but there are things that are really, really relevant to the pandemic that Israel is good at, and we can increase our involvement and the advice we give other countries. For example, many developing countries are asking for advice from Israel about the regulation of Israel in different spheres of health. So for example, regulation of drugs, regulation of private, public health, and the relationship between the two of them, and so on. Okay. Water as well, water management. I think long-term, Israel can also talk long-term and give advice on how to do long-term policies and regulation.
Okay. Mr. Eyal Meidan, are you here with me? Thank
Yes.
you. It's good to see you. You are the director of Multilateral Development Banks Division in the Ministry of Finance. So maybe you can, shed a light about your, from your part of the deal, how does, the international cooperation and development works.
Of course, and thank you for having me. I just want to refer to the last sentence that Ron has mentioned, and to mention a collaboration that is now taking part between the Healthcare IL, which is under the Ministry of Health, and they sell knowledge to Inter-American Development Bank. They are now in the signing process. So just referring to what Ron has said, we do have a lot of things as a government to contribute to the developing countries. But I want to refer from my job or responsibilities to mainly to promote Israeli technologies and innovation in order to support the developing countries and also to boost Israeli trade. And the people here were talking about all the challenges that the developing world and all the world is now facing. But I think that alongside with those great challenges, there are great opportunities for the private sector, and even more, I would say, the gap could not be filled by only governmental and international aid. It has to be also private money that come into the developing countries and support them. So I would like to say in a few sentences why I think that Israeli companies should be more engaged with developing banks, with the developing countries, and specifically working with the development banks. Because I think that there is a win-win situation here, and it is not exploited enough. So in just a few sentences, the potential is huge. Just in 2019, nearly $100 billion were invested in the banks that Israel are part of. And the Israeli companies that already realized the potential that those banks has awarded $250 million out of this amount of money that is investing. We think that more that the Israeli expertise in the cyber, water, agriculture, health, energy, those expertise are very, very relevant to the developing countries, and we think that more Israeli companies should take part and be engaged with the banks project, and I can give a few examples later on.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Asaf Barnea, you are on the other hand of the assistant with your Sanara Ventures. You are nurturing companies that are dealing with medical innovation, right? And did you find yourself in this year, bringing assistant to the world and helping, or how was it? How do you describe 2020?
Well, obviously the pandemic is a game-changing event. I mean, basically, even if we're looking into the United States, whatever was done with going to see your physician, going to the hospital, now there's the new normal, as we've been saying, and the new normal is digital first. So, for instance, the transition that we've been seeing now towards telemedicine, including companies that we have within Sanara Ventures, companies such as My Home Doc, which is a telemedicine device for remote diagnostic. We shall see more and more of those, let it be out of Israel or regardless, coming in and basically provides the ability through technologies, not just to dive into a new concept of delivering care and the access of care definitely in growth markets, but also in countries whereby the practices were there in stagnation, with bureaucracy and conservativeness, and basically there has to be a change. If we look into the expenses, just within the US, for that matter, would have been 18 to 19% of the GDP of the US attributed to medical expenses. In Israel, it's about 7 to 8%. But this is not acceptable, and definitely in growth markets where we need to come up with new technologies to deliver care in a different way, in a very fundamental way.
Do you see the innovation in this year, or it was such a shock for everybody, and it needed a lot of, thoughts of how to proceed. But did you see some new ideas? Did you see the human spirit coming up with, great ideas?
Very much so, very much so. First of all, also on behalf of the Export Institute, I'm acting as the chairman of the Life Science Board in the Export Institute. So overall, we've been seeing and we've been sending like a digital catalog with about 70 related solutions to COVID-19, direct and indirect solution out of Israel, generally speaking.
Such as?
Different things for remote monitoring, basically for potentially diagnostic at-home, personalized medicine, wellness and prevention before. So some of which were directly related to COVID-19, but some of which were related to respiratory and other things, which obviously the demand has been increased by the pandemic. But as has been said always, a crisis is an opportunity, and this is what we've been seeing. A tremendous change also from high-tech personnel in Israel. It came up and all of a sudden brought some new technologies for mitigating the pandemic or other infection diseases within hospitals. So various systems to control that and be able to support it, let it be with employers in hospitals. So various solutions, not all of which will be sustainable, not all of which will be deployed, obviously. But the amounts of innovation that we've been seeing in Israel and across the board obviously pushes very much so digital health out of Israel and also in other markets.
All right, Mr. Ariel Delumi, speaking from the point of view of international cooperation, and how do you see the world from here proceeding with maybe putting a little bit more emphasis on private sector like that, or on getting the money out of the government to direct it to the right places?
So Shalom Tal, it's great being here. I think that we as civil society organizations, NGOs, we are facing global challenges as well as local challenges. And the fact that international traveling was almost stopped at some points, the fact that we are facing a global recession, and the fact that funding for international development was diverted from traditional support, for example, in TB, HIV, malaria, and now is moved to coronavirus, is now creating new challenges for international development. And indeed, we already have first indicators that TB, malaria, HIV are now in the increased side. Civil society organizations have several advantages over big aid agencies and government agencies. We are more flexible. We can work in places where official Israel sometimes cannot work, and then open the bridge for official Israel agencies to come over. And we also have better understanding and better connections to the communities. Now, despite all the challenges that we are facing these days, I believe that we also have a very big opportunity. In my perspective, this is a disruptive moment for international development.
You're using the high-tech term of disruption, which always afterwards comes a new product.
Yes, and I will say why, because for many years we preached for values such as working with communities, working bottom up, working with local organizations. And the truth of the matter is that we have not always been very loyal to these principles and values. And I think that today we have an opportunity to decentralize international development. And my suggestion for Israeli NGOs is to help local NGOs be more adaptive to the current situation, be more transparent. I think that they should be more accountable, help them to be more accountable. And maybe more important, start and speak the international language, the language of international development agencies, because in many cases, local NGOs do not speak the language and they cannot pass the bureaucracy, they cannot pass the red tape that many international agencies have, and they cannot connect to the money that you mentioned before. Right. But also to other resources.
So talking about the money, I will go back right now to Mr. Reifer and Mr. Maidan, both of you the same question, I suppose. So we are in an era where it's not only the pandemic, but also no budget and no money and no allocations. And it's definitely, it's not your fault and it's not your, maybe your decision, but it puts stress and challenge that we did not expect here in Israel. How can a country help its own citizens, or maybe, you know, help other citizens of the global community with such a restrictions on the budget? Ron, we'll go first. Mr. Reifer?
Sure. I think you are touching a delicate point. And as I said in what I said earlier, we have a budget problem. And this is why I think the solutions that we are looking to find are solutions that use money or governmental money and leverage it through either private sector money or international organizations' money, and basically creating a bigger impact with the limited budgets that we have. I think this is generally speaking about an answer to what you are saying. And I think this is also what the international community or the international development community is looking at when they see development in the next decade. The OECD that is advising us on this process is putting the issue of private sector engagement and blended finance as the hottest topics for the next decade of development. And this gives us some comfort in terms of financing. Also, I have to say that the government of Israel is not fully on board with this concept of development, unfortunately. But when you phrase it differently and you understand, as Eyal said, that it's a win-win situation, that the working in international development doesn't mean that you are just doing it for altruistic reasons, and you're doing it only is donating money for the developing countries. When you phrase it differently, it's not only a matter of phrasing, it's actually the truth that it could bring a lot of opportunities for the Israeli private sector as well. I think money and budget could be found for that if you show the ROI for Israel as well.
So, Mr. Maidan, Eyal, taking exactly from where Ron left it, what do we get back for our interests when we work with development banks, and what do we get from that as Israelis?
Okay, yeah, so as I promised, I have an example just for that question. So if we are talking about the ROI, okay, so I do think that the main thing is that we want to contribute to the world and to aid those developing countries, but also of course, it's a win-win situation. And one example for what the government is doing is the fund, the trust fund that we have with the IDB, Inter-American Development Bank, in the field of cyber. So we invested there $3 million in 2018, and this trust fund, which helped developing countries to learn about cyber, and we brought the representatives from their governments to Israel to learn about cyber, because we are very strong in the cyber field. Because of the connections that Israel has generated because of this fund that we donated, $60 million of contracts were signing with the countries in Latin America. So it was a donation of $3 million and generated $60 million of signed contracts. So this is what is in it for us. Okay, this is just one example, and because of we are looking, and the government is also always looking, and the Ministry of Finance specifically, always looking for more engines for growth. Okay, so this is just another example for an engine of growth that can be that we can have.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Barnea, going back to you in your private sector, and we heard earlier from Ambassador Schlein how, with respect to personal diplomacy, it's a challenge because diplomatic world used to, an assistant and development used to go around the world, meet with people, and see their needs. Now you are a business person. You were probably traveling all around the world until March, when it's all ended at one day immediately. Can you tell us a bit about how do you, creative minds, innovation, and, reaching to people's needs in order when you develop a concept or a medicine or a device, and you have to do it everything by Zoom. Is it, what has changed for you personally?
Obviously, it's changed, specifically if you need to push through and become a champion of a certain technology or whatever. Eventually, you have to meet people face to face, and we are all been looking forward to do so. So in terms of the process...
Did you leave the State of Israel since March?
Well, I just came back from Dubai.
Okay,
which
of course.
It was interesting to see it.
So the only place we can fly to, you went, right?
Yeah, well, we're trying to do business over there, but it's... I'd like to emphasize the moment we are able to push through innovation, medical innovation, healthcare innovation again, this has to be some kind of a different kind of collaboration. One of the things that we did with the World Bank, me as an advisor to the IFC, to the World Bank, in terms of knowledge sharing, and this is something that I'm stating repeatedly to the Ministry of Health and to other organizations, we brought in two...
do they listen?
Yeah, they do. They do. So with that, even though we are, as a venture capitalist, we invest in things which basically invent the wheel, like disruptive technologies. Nonetheless, on the international collaboration, we have to go deeper and deeper into knowledge sharing. And two examples very quickly. One of the things that we did with the World Bank is a project called TAC Emerge. We've been bringing medical innovation to India, later on to Brazil, and now to Africa with that project of the World Bank and the IFC, actually, and testing and validating new technologies in India, or let it be cervical cancer, let it be for malaria, let it be for anything else, which exists out there in Israel, in Spain, in New Zealand. But the Indian hospitals which work with the World Bank did not know about. Same goes for Brazil, same goes for Africa. This is one thing. So it's a technology transfer from an ecosystem one to another, and also knowledge sharing. The second would be actually from Norway, out of Norway, there's a company called Induct, which basically it's a knowledge sharing platform for connecting 81 hospitals. And once there's an implementation of new technology, let it be a new approach for detection of breast cancer, which is actually a real example from Oslo University Hospital, the moment they embrace a new technology, a new process, and they shorten the diagnostic time from 12 weeks to 1 week, and this is a real story, it was shared by 80 other hospitals.
Wow.
Sponsored by the government, the Norwegian government, to increase or incentivize the hospitals to do so. So on one hand, the private sector, and we and the government as well, we invest in disruptive technologies in the medical space. On the other, as governments, as global cooperation and ecosystem, we have to step more and more into pragmatic examples of knowledge sharing, because there's no need to invest the wheel, to invent the wheel and again, but rather invest in knowledge sharing and spread existing knowledge to wider regions.
Thank you. So, Mr. Delumi, last closing comment for the day. How do you think that the world of development and humanitarian aid is going to take it from here? Give us your vision. What's going to happen next?
So, as I said before, we are in a disruptive moment for international development. I think there will be much more space now for local players, local NGOs. And in the Israeli context, I would like to say a few very quick things. First of all, innovation is not only about technology. Innovation, in my opinion, is finding solutions to unsolvable problems. And in Israel, we have gained many social assets over the years: absorption of immigration, community health programs, working with disabled people, and so on and so forth. Our aim now is try to commercialize these social assets and to increase social export in addition to commercialized commodities. The second issue, I think, is to find ways for Israeli NGOs to better work with Israeli government. Today, we are working in Seed Israel on offering the government several mechanisms for Mashav and other agencies to be working with Israeli NGOs. This is by now very, very limited, but I think that there are many mechanisms such as joint ventures, grants, tenders, and so on, where the Israeli government can increase its impact by working with NGOs and with commercial companies. And I think the last point that I would like to say is about Israeli regulation. Unfortunately, Israeli regulation today is not helping Israeli NGOs in the international sector. Some of the problem we have managed to solve, such as tax exemption status for Israeli NGOs. But still, a very simple example, Israeli volunteers that go abroad with T-shirts with the Israeli flag, identify themselves as Israelis, are still not insured by the Israeli social insurance. And these are regulations that can be changed and really help Israeli NGOs. And we are really, by now, in the very first days to realize the potential of Israeli NGOs in international development.
Right. Okay, let me thank Ron Eifer at the Prime Minister Office, Eyal Meidan at the Ministry of Finance, Asaf Barnea from Sanera Ventures, and Ariel Delumi from Seed.